Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Finding Genius video series. I'm joined by Dr. Francisco Gimenez. Thanks for taking the time.
Hey, thank you so much, Kunal.
Yeah. Francisco is a partner with 8VC, and he's focused on their bio IT practice. He also received a PhD from Stanford in biomedical informatics. He's won the Martin Epstein Award for the best paper at the American Medical Informatics Association in 2014. And he was also the commencement speaker for Stanford School of Medicine in 2015. So I am pretty sure that by the end of this conversation, I'm going to feel pretty dumb and unsuccessful. So I think this is a good way for us to learn a bit more about bioinformatics and just extract some of the learnings from a long career and successful career that you've had. But it's before we get into that, it's been an interesting year. I think the last time we spoke, you were still in San Francisco and buying a home there. Are you still
hmm
in the Bay Area?
Yeah, I bought the home. I had a kid. I'm long San Francisco. Uh,
Nice,
I,
congratulations.
yeah, our fund moved to Austin, but
Oh, okay,
I am holding down the sort of SF office, due in large part to the fact that biotech is a little less amenable to remote work, and there's really sort of two epicenters of biotech. It's the Bay Area and Boston. And so my colleague
interesting.
David has gone out to Boston, started a satellite office. I'm holding on the SF office. Once again, cells don't like to get on Zoom. So you just
Yeah,
have to work
right.
within life.
And what draws, I guess, founders to the biotech ecosystem in the Bay Area? Is it because of larger companies that are there, or just because of the labs and the space has already been developed for a couple of years?
Yeah, it's several parts of it, right? So the origin of biotech was in San Francisco, really the Bay Area, right? Genentech was, the first biotech which coined the term, and that was out of UC Berkeley, and famously one of Kleiner's first investments. And from there, a lot of the Genentech alumni started biotech companies out here. And then historically, what happened is that the center of gravity shifted to Boston for several decades. And I think there were two driving reasons, though a lot of people have a lot of explanations as to why. But in my mind, the two driving things are the internet in San Francisco took over, and it was a way better investment space in 1994, and basically for the next decade, two maybe even 2 decades, to invest in internet companies. Right? They were less capital efficient. They were more capital efficient. You could exit them within 2 to 3 years for unbelievably high, IPO prices, and obviously dot-com bubble and all that stuff. So what you'll famously see is like uh, um, funds like Menlo, for example, which incubated Gilead, basically stopped all biotech investing around 94, 95, and several other funds followed suit. And even the Boston fund, several of them were doing the same thing when they were moving into internet technologies. Um, and it makes sense, incredibly high capex, incredibly high scientific risk, really difficult. You had a regulatory body of the FDA that was really difficult to deal with back then. And then otherwise, you basically just make a website and turn that into a billion-dollar company. It's like obvious that you should be doing that.
Right.
The other part of this that I heard relayed to me once was that Novartis started their Novartis Institute of Biomedical Research, NIBR, and they were deciding where to put the headquarters, and they were really deciding between San Francisco, and they were looking at Boston because it had some exposure there. It wasn't as big as it was today, and they ended up choosing Boston mainly because headquarters of Novartis in Switzerland were just closer in time zone, and that really became the genesis of what is Kendall Square today. In the Boston area.
Interesting.
And so between those two things, you basically have every single VC sell out of biotech. And so there's no cash here anymore. Though you have a lot of skills and a lot of people in South San Francisco never went away. And then Boston was basically seeded. And then you created this next gen version of biotech investing, which was the sort of incubation model of like the 2008, Third Rock was famous for this. Atlas switched to an incubation model. Flagship switched to an incubation model, which is kind of the model du jour today, which I'll get into in a second. Um,
Yeah, so sorry.
yeah, go ahead.
No, so what changed then from the winter of biotech that you were talking about where folks weren't
Yeah.
investing in it? I mean, the high capex and the scientific risk. And I guess around when you started also studying bioinformatics,
Hmm.
what was leading to that resurgence of the field beyond incubations, and what was changing on the technology side? That'd be interesting just from a Genesis standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're still kind of connecting the dots as to what happened, and why it's happening. But so we have several things that have happened, right? Um, One of the major turning points, of course, is the Human Genome Project, which led to sequencing technologies and those becoming much cheaper. And so a lot of biosciences became data sciences. Managing that, a lot of informaticians and computational people were going into this, and there was like this whole promise of precision medicine off the basis of sequencing. Then you have this idea that um, uh, consumer internet technology companies, although many people are challenging this today, but there was a notion that a lot of consumer web was kind of was becoming less of an enticing space to invest in, right? Like the last major IPO of that was something like Snapchat for a while, right? Now we look at Clubhouse and a variety of other
Right.
things, and there's clearly a renaissance. And so people are moving into things like vertical SaaS, AI-driven technologies, and right, VC is very much a function of technological waves. One of our driving questions is what's possible now that wasn't possible 5 years ago. That's where we should be investing. And so I think there was people looking for interesting new areas. And so we basically had this complete emergence of technologies, obviously sequencing. I like to joke about the fact that um, between 2011 and 2012 was possibly one of the most productive scientific years with respect to impactful science in at least 50 years, if not a century. I like to jokingly refer to it as like Einstein's 1905 Annus Mirabilis. We basically got in 1 year the first CRISPR paper published. AlexNet beats ImageNet, which spawned the AI age. We cured the first person with a CAR T therapy. We got the first approval for a gene therapy. Like all of these now individually were $100 billion industries created, and now the intersection of those is like really amazing. And so I think we're still drafting off that, and a lot of people just haven't looked back and realized we're basically using a lot of these technologies, and because there's a slower life cycle and churn process with respect to how biotech manifests, we're still kind of in that summer or spring, if you will, of after that sort of more difficult investing window.
Interesting. And was there common building blocks that led to that 2011, 2012 almost scientific revolution or renaissance that you would describe?
I mean, the AI one was orthogonal, right? I think the one common theme amongst all these things is they were the canonical 20-year overnight successes, right? Neural networks with backprop have existed since 85, and it was just like a small cohort of people who were super dedicated to making them work. Gene therapy, of course, had been in existence for several decades before and went through a winter after the Jesse Gelsinger incident in the late 90s, but people really stuck with it. CAR Ts, similarly, like the first versions of them were published around the late 80s, and people were just super dedicated to making these things work. And it just so happened that a lot of them came together in this window. And of course, CRISPR, the original CRISPR sequences in the early 90s, and just a lot of people were just like, this is really cool. I want to keep studying it.
Right.
I could not tell you why this all happened at once. I'm sure there's like some smarter philosophy of science person or who can explain that, but to some degree, it's just like noticing it and being able to turn that into enterprise value is kind of where we've been fortunate.
Right. And I guess so the field of bioinformatics is extremely powerful with some of the areas that you just mentioned and the things that led to it. If we're to choose one of those areas, so folks that are new to bioinformatics as a field and go deep on that, which would be one area that you think at this point in time is probably the most compelling or an area where you're spending most of your time? And I have some of your companies that I
Yeah,
wanted to go in after around Alloy and Mammoth Bio and their
yeah,
specific focus on drug discovery
yeah.
and CRISPR itself. But what area from 2011 or 2012 do you think has evolved the most? And if you could just give some perspective on it, so newcomers to bioinformatics can understand it as well.
So I'll give you two areas. You can choose which one you want to drill down on. One is this notion of what we're calling complex medicines, like cell and gene therapies. So if you think about like the history of therapeutics, right? It was basically small molecules, which is the official term. It's not just like some cutesy term, but there's an official scientific definition, small molecule. And this basically spawned from the textile industry along the Rhine River in the mid 19th century. Dyeing companies, basically, and all the big pharma company names you know today were started as textile companies. And they just had really good chemists and were able to, when we figured out we could sort of manipulate the human body with these exogenous small molecules. And then it just turns out these chemists who were using this to dye wools or whatever were actually able to like cure diseases. They pivoted these entire companies towards becoming pharmaceuticals.
I did not know that. Which
Yeah,
pharmaceuticals started like that?
you have like I'm gonna get all the names wrong, but like Merck, like it was Pfizer. If you actually look at the major ones, the problem is the names don't line up appropriately. There's
Yeah.
also like there's like basically this whole phylogeny tree of like pharmas that start as textile industries and merging. And so you see these like little trees on Wikipedia of like,
Wow.
50 years of mergers and acquisitions where, the
It's
name
very
today,
interesting.
like Novartis, Merck, Pfizer, so on and so forth, they've just existed for so long, but they started as chemistry companies. Um,
Wow. Okay.
and then we had this sort of next generation of drugs called biologics, which is when we discovered antibodies in our body could be produced and given to people as drugs. And that was like in the 80s. And then, and so a lot of these chemistry companies had switched to biology companies. And that was, all the best-selling drugs today and some of the most impactful drugs today are biologics themselves, antibody drugs and whatnot. And with the first curing a person with a CAR T, um, people are going to argue with my statement, but I'm going to stick with it. In like 2011, and then gene therapy is sort of coming into vogue. We just kind of found out that there's these more complex mechanisms beyond just sort of native biology, but like engineering the biology. So the cells can be engineered to be therapies. Viruses can be engineered to deliver new genes into our bodies that are restore function. And all of these things are kind of what we call complex medicines because there's some combination of engineering plus biology. Um, and I think that's been this huge wave of investment and focus. A lot of cancers that previously were untouchable have become newly touchable. And the fact that we get to be part and parcel of this completely new generation of therapies is kind of a unique point in time. So
Can you talk about
that's
some of those therapies
yeah.
specifically around cancer?
Yeah, so a CAR T therapy is where we take a cell, your own cell, and mainly one of your white blood cells, so they're used to kill disease. Frequently, our body has mutational changes that would be considered cancerous, but our body takes care of those cells before they spawn into cancer and grow out of control. And that's like our immune system actually does that, is constantly fighting cancer in our bodies. Um, and cancer really, becomes a disease when that, that cell evades our immune system and then proliferates, and then grows into what we think of as tumors and whatnot. Um, and so the notion here is why don't we take out our immune system and then give it tools and engineer it to actually identify that cancer? And so cancer is evading our immune system, and now we've given it more tools and sort of like patched it, if you will, to
Right.
recognize that sort of missing signal. And so those are T cells, right? And part of our native immune system, Bio 101. A CAR stands for Chimeric Antigen Receptor. Um, and so basically what it means is you got two pieces of our native biology, a TCR, which is a T cell receptor, and that's a signaling domain, and it kind of tells our cell what to do. And then you have an antibody, which is kind of a binding domain, and we fuse them together. And so that's why we call it a chimeric antigen receptor. So you have your receptor, and then you basically have your signaling domain, and then we put that onto a cell. And you have the business end of the antibody outside of the cell, and it's looking for cancers that we teach it to look for. And then we have a signaling domain that says, like, okay, when you find that cancer, go eat it and kill
Okay.
it. And so we give that protein into these cells. We engineer them. They express it natively. We put into their DNA. And then we put it back into your body, and it just runs around and looks for the cancerous cells, and then defeats them. And it's one of the most exciting, innovative treatments. And now we're thinking about, how do we not just do this in cancer? How do we do this in
Right.
things like diabetes? How do we do this in regenerative diseases or whatnot?
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And I guess on a different note, when you're thinking about these complex medications and development, I guess this past year at ABC was probably very interesting for you as you were looking at businesses and scientists who were developing and delivering vaccine. And it was probably a fairly common conversation in your circles. Could you just talk a
Yeah.
bit about your observations? Was this a tipping point for bioinformatics as well as they were looking at all this data? I know they created a COVID-19 data bank recently in the EU.
Yeah.
Would love to learn more about just your observations during COVID as well.
Yeah. So there are many observations. I'll stick to my personal favorites, which is that if we continue on that line of complex medicines, right? So we've got cell therapies, we've got gene therapies, mRNA basically being considered one of these complex medicines,
Right.
right? And that's the technology behind the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. So I can recap mRNA if relevant. Otherwise, I
No,
can just dive into it.
yeah, I feel like that everybody's heard about enough now at
Yeah,
this
yeah.
point.
So I think the thing to think about here, and there's been a bunch of great popular science articles written about this now, is that Moderna has existed for roughly 10 years. And for the
Right.
longest time, scientists were like, will mRNA ever be a viable drug therapeutic? Like, and if you actually look at the Moderna stock, it was trading flat or down to its IPO. And there was a bunch of discussion about, like, is this hype? Is it not? Like, are they actually doing anything? Like, or is this just really cool technology that has no application? Which has basically happened with every single interesting novel therapeutic modality. Like antibodies, everybody's like, who the fuck would do that?
Right. Right.
And with mRNA, we're just like, oh, who knows? Like, maybe they can make vaccines or
Might
something.
work.
And so it was just like an amazing bit of foresight to put money into these technologies, saying these platforms are going to be useful. We do have a strong sort of belief, and that's like the role of a great venture capitalist, right? Is to, and this wasn't our investment, so it was flagship, but like to be able to say, we believe in this platform so much, we do think it's the right thing for a variety of use cases. And it just so happens that, COVID made it very, very useful very quickly, right? And so my favorite statistic, and it was a very worrying one about a year ago, was that, the shortest time to ever make a vaccine in history was 4 years.
Yeah.
And the one that we're giving to people was made in something like 42 days or something like that. Like
It's
literally
incredible.
from sequence to design, right? And then they had to run the trials and everything, but like holy crap, in like 42 days, like that is the amazing part of these platform biologies. And so there's like so many kinds of that science happening today that are just like really compelling platforms, and we're kind of looking for the right use case for them. And so in the notion of like there's product market fit in tech, right? Like I built my product, I need to find the market, and then
Right.
they kind of like scream together. We like to call it like tech target fit, which is where does the technology fit with a like target for treating disease. And I think with Moderna and Pfizer, that was like the what happens when you have tech target fit is just like these like both just like from patient impact, but also just from enterprise value sales and all that stuff. Like, so I think that's one of the most compelling things in my mind is there's so many platform companies today, and people are like, should we invest in this? Should we not? Whatever. And the public markets are starting to realize that, look, if we get access to these really compelling platforms and they figure out their kind of home run model, that there's going to be huge value to be made there. And now we're seeing it reflected because there's much more public market appetite for biotech, which gives us the affordance to be able to go in and start taking more, exciting technological and biological risk.
Interesting. Yeah, that leads me to my next question about Zymergen, Recursion Pharma, Moderna.
Yeah.
We've seen more of these companies go public. Moderna's
hmm
been public for a while. But as a venture investor, when you're evaluating these businesses, and granted you have a PhD, so you have a lot more expertise in this, but what exactly are you looking for? I mean, I've asked this question because the name of the book is Finding Genius. The series is named
hmm
Finding Genius. And for just a traditional VC who's invested in enterprise or consumer businesses, those metrics look very different. But
hmm
when you're
hmm
looking at a business and saying, okay, Moderna has now proven this science, or the CAR T is now is working towards other types of
hmm
cancers and other types of diseases, when you're looking at Alloy Therapeutics or Mammoth Bio, how much of it is the management team? How much of it is the science itself, or where we are right now in the state of time? You were saying that what was possible now versus 5 years ago. Is
hmm
that your common question that you're asking between each investment you're making? But would just love to learn a bit about your process when you're looking at these companies.
Right. I'll caveat everything by saying like there's a lot of different approaches here, even in the biotech landscape. So my views are my own. I don't even know, like, broadly shared by the team, but even they disagree with me on many of these points.
Okay.
So um, so I think we have to start at the business model. So if you're a traditional therapeutics discovery company, we need to see our preference is to invest in platforms, because it doesn't mean we're sticking to just a singular indication and hoping for a Hail Mary, but rather there's a technology that allows us to really identify the right and sort of best fit use case. And that's kind of bringing our tech mentality into biotech. Um, and then you really need to look at who is the founding team. Um, and it's not that different from anything else. I think the nuance is basically, can you trust somebody to do great science? Um, but also under the sort of constraints of being a biotech and needing to, like, be lean but move quickly. There are great scientists who just want to be super thorough and move unbelievably slowly, and then you just run out of oxygen. And then there's plenty of scientists who just kind of want to cut corners, and so it's really about identifying these really great scientists who, coupled with these magical technologies and platforms, can really fuse those two and extract products that are going to treat patients. Um, and so, that's kind of like just such an obvious thing to say.
No,
And
but that's helpful because I mean, I think that is also your investments sort of speak, not to, they speak from, with Jennifer Doudna
yeah,
and Mammoth Bio, and
yeah.
she's all over the news now because of the subject of the new book and CRISPR. But I guess when you were making that investment, what stood out about her specifically, and in working with her also
Yeah.
as an investor, what have you learned in terms of those great scientists that are thinking about things?
So, okay, so actually, like, I'll use Mammoth as a case study, maybe as a second model of
Okay.
the business model of therapeutics. Mammoth now, has very interesting therapeutics programs, but that wasn't originally how it started. The genesis story was actually quite different. But when the model is more of a traditional business model, like a revenue generating entity, as opposed to a biotech, which is really an IP generating entity. We're discovering novel drugs to treat patients, but the reality is most biotechs never actually commercialize their drugs. They end up getting acquired by pharma, who's focusing much more on externalizing the research and taking the heavy burden of taking these things through trials and commercializing them. So in biotech thinking, you've got to be like, the market, the bottom line market is always patients, but the other market here is like pharmas that want this IP, and that's frequently how the exits go. Um, And so you can be looking at a disease that no pharma wants to cure, even though you might be, or no pharma wants to purchase. Uh, and a lot of
Right.
cardiovascular disease, statins or whatever, and the science might be super compelling and the team might be great, but like you might never be able to exit it because nobody wants this, because it might be competitive to them, or because there's so many good drugs on the market in generics formats today, you couldn't justify an expensive new drug. And what that necessarily means is a company would have to raise billions of dollars to be able to take it to market, and frequently they can't do that. And so you have to think about the appetite for the exits as in addition to the patient need. Um, on the flip side, we've got these more traditional business models like Therapeutics, or Mammoth to some degree, because they're building out a diagnostics business, which actually they can commercialize themselves. But these are companies where we just think about them in more traditional sort of business terms, like market size, revenue, what, so on and so forth.
Right. Right.
Um, for Mammoth, the story was really interesting. Was that it was originally just Trevor Martin and Ashley, his co-founder at the time, who were looking at interesting diagnostic technologies and figured out, using CRISPR to do detection of small nucleic, like basically small trace amounts of nucleic acids. Um, and they got the rights to some of this amazing stuff, and we were like, this tech is super compelling. And so when they were raising the seed investment, we're like, okay, we want to put money in this because we just think this tech is super compelling. There's literally no chance to lose your money on this because somebody's going to want this. I think the problem is that a lot of the tech was invented in Jennifer Doudna's lab, but Berkeley was sold off the IP basically to the first bidder, which was problematic for a while and ruffled some feathers. And I think one of the most amazing things I've seen in terms of like true value add VC was Ursheet at Mayfield, who basically got them all in a room, Trevor and Ashley and then Jennifer with Lucas and Janice, and said, there's no way this company survives without all of you being together. And he actually fused them as a founding team and said, you cannot work apart. And then capitalize the company, saying, if we can work it out, we're all, I will invest in your Series A. And so that's like,
Wow.
I guess, the untold story of it. And I'm just like, that's next level, like VC shit. Like I'm just like,
Yeah. Right.
yeah. And it's done fantastically well, and they've been able to raise so many rounds of capital and do so well along so many dimensions. It's just like, I would love to say we were like super geniuses, but honestly, it was just like being like, this tech is really cool, let's put money into it. And then Ursheet just like really knocked it out of the park with respect to really putting the company behind that tech.
Wow. That's interesting. And I guess so you've shared a bit about your optimism for the space and everything that's happening. I guess when you're thinking about there are cynics. I mean, almost at the end of every podcast that you listen on CRISPR
Hmm.
or bioinformatics, or it ends with biohacking and it ends with
Yeah.
superhumans, and it ends with how much of that is real, or something that ethically we should be concerned about from your perspective when you are funding these companies, and how much of it in your area of focus does it end up coming
Yeah.
up with founders that are starting these businesses or thinking about it? Just your broad thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I think that I'm not an ethicist, so I can't, but we have to recognize that we make decisions that impact society, and so you can't ignore them. But within the framework of drug discovery and therapeutics in the U.S. system, um, I don't think that comes up too frequently, honestly. Um, Companies are pitching us like diseases of high unmet need and technologies to ameliorate those diseases. Um, so it's not a frequent case. Every once in a while, we do see maybe people outside the bounds of like the standard structure. I think the sort of biohacking community does some really interesting stuff, but you know leaves a lot of open questions, right? Like in
Yeah.
terms of like, should we, but but I think they also make really good points about like bodily autonomy, because a lot of these people are self-experimenting, and so it's like, I'm of two minds, in that I do not think we should necessarily be preventing people to do what they want with their own bodies. Um, and a lot of these things, it's like the people like options of last resort. Like a lot of the people looking for treatments for Crohn's disease were looking at FMTs, fecal microbiome transplants, um, or other kinds of conditions like, or people doing nootropics to sort of improve their cognitive abilities or whatever. And it's like, I don't know if I could get into an ethical debate so much as say like, I don't see, you have to have a large burden of proof to say to me that we should be stopping people from doing what they want with their own bodies.
Right.
Um,
Right.
I do think that there's a broad gap from that to doing things to other people's bodies, right? And specifically, the one that people are looking at is like germline editing, and
Yeah.
embryonic editing. And of course, He Jiankui yeah, had the Chinese CRISPR baby story. Um, I I'm very uncomfortable with that. We try to avoid investing in things of that nature, but
But is
um,
that an eventuality where it's going to happen anyway, regardless of what's going on in the U.S. system or whatever 8VC decides to fund? Do you believe just
it
the technology for all these
it
things
might
in the
be.
next 10 years is moving in that?
Well, actually, let me put a thought experiment to you. Um,
Uh-oh.
do you have children?
I do not know, but I have nieces
Okay,
and nephews.
sure. Did any of your family members or people you know are having children do a test for Down syndrome?
They did, yeah.
What action would they have taken if the test came out
Right,
positive?
right.
So we make
Yeah,
these decisions that
it,
impact other lives,
right, right.
Now let's take it one step further and look at NIPT and say like, okay, beyond Down syndrome, what other, genetic conditions are people going to have? Now let's take it a step further and look at IVF, right? Where we're going to basically test, say 8 fertilized eggs, and then see which one of them has diseases.
Yeah,
Now flip that question and say, which one of them is going to have the most beneficial characteristics? So
right.
there's one thing of like downside protection, the other side one of upside
Upside.
optimization. And I think that's where I start to get, it gets weird to everybody when you talk to them about
Yeah,
selecting the best embryo as opposed to removing, possibly diseased ones.
right. And that's all. I mean, it's incredible technology that they can even do that, and we can address issues like that. But I guess where the Jennifer Doudna podcast ended with Walter Isaacson was where they were talking about improving athletic abilities and
Hmm.
thinking about how in the future you would have these superhumans, and China and Russia are already
Yeah.
investing in those. So that's where I think it starts to spin towards more of a dystopian. But right now, the way technology stands, that's why it just was interesting just to hear your thoughts on that all.
Yeah. I mean, we're all okay with curing disease. So
Right.
I think that's,
Yeah.
um,
That's
but like,
table stakes.
but like this is kind of like a different commentary on maybe just how the US healthcare system. Now, here's another thought experiment.
Right. Right.
How the US healthcare system thinks about disease, which is that it's broadly reactive. And everybody complains
Mm,
about that. We're not very good at preventative medicine, but we're very good at reactive medicine. I would argue we're best in the world at reactive medicine. And when we figured out with COVID, like we could never convince people to wear masks broadly just to prevent spread of the disease, but we were
right.
very good at giving people vaccinations or figuring out how to treat them when they got COVID. Like
Yeah.
that is the US healthcare system in a nutshell. And
Right.
so we're the best in the world at maybe the worst way to treat people. Um,
Yeah.
but like, so now think about this in the perspective of, engineering babies or superhumans or whatever. Like, uh, it might be the first time we have this notion of maybe not preventative, but proactive healthcare, which is like where we're trying to actually increase people's sort of fitness ability as opposed to remove
Right.
their disease burden.
Right.
Do I agree with that? No, not necessarily about engineering children, but it's also like that's a weird way for this conversation to sway, given like how we construct our entire infrastructure here. Um,
Yeah.
and then the real concern I have is that this is kind of like the argument of like, why don't we just let NFL players do steroids? Um, because if we just allow, an NFL player to do steroids, within a year, every NFL player has to do steroids. Um, like they won't be able to compete otherwise. There will be total inequity if you decide to go natural. And now these are really expensive interventions. They're super theoretical. It's like possibly dangerous. And we're going to say like the upside is so great that if you don't take this risk, your child will be inequitable with respect to other children who were willing to take on this risk. And so we're just going to end up with this extremely unequal society if we don't, control for that. But many
Right.
people would say like inequality is a factor of life and we should reward people who take the risk. Um, I don't know if I have an answer. I'm just kind of
That's a
elucidating like,
fascinating.
yeah,
No, it's fascinating. I mean, it's a really fascinating conversation. I think it's going to continue to play out. I know we're up on time, but just as a last question, I think what would be helpful also is how do you, given you have a strong foundation in all of this, get smart on new areas of bioinformatics? What's your process? Are you reading certain things? Are you following certain people? And given that, I mean, your baseline of knowledge is already significantly higher than everybody else's, but people that are interested in this topic, do you
yeah,
have a framework that you use to get smart on a new technology or a new piece of this?
man, I so frequently feel dumb. That's the real
Imagine how I
that's the
feel right
real
now.
secret is that you know but it's like I've studied a bunch of stuff, but like as anybody will tell you who's done a PhD, there's like epsilon width and infinite depth. And so when people come to me with their fancy new science, which is fields away from mine, um, you know, I might know little to nothing. Uh, and so beyond like basically the standard language, I'm like, oh
Right.
crap, I have to learn everything here.
Yeah.
And so my process is, I think, ad hoc like everybody else's, is like, if there's a textbook in the space, those are usually wonderful initial ways to go. Um, and then I really love reading if somebody in the field has even just written some kind of nonfiction piece that's dumbed down for popular science. Like, I always think that's really helpful just to get the language, you know,
Yeah. Right.
uh,
Right.
you know, what are the words, what are the primary concerns, whatever. And then you can go into like a textbook, and then you can actually start going into papers. Review papers are really kind of the go-to model.
Right.
Um, and so if you go to like Nature Reviews X for the field that you're looking at, you'll probably find somebody reviewing the field. But like if you just assume like 10% retention rate of all information of any like, and some people are really smart and they have like 90% retention, good for them. If I just assume 10%, it's just like read the easy 10% first and then start reading harder and harder versions. And that's kind of my model here. Like basic
That's
YouTube
interesting.
videos, Khan Academy. It's like, I don't think you should ever feel like you have to dive into really difficult literature. I have no qualms about seeing like the most basic introductory story and then building upon that.
Right. And what are some of those fiction or nonfiction books that you're reading to get that sense of it?
Yeah, so let's take immunology, which is an important, extremely important and growing importance field. There's like a great sort of nonfiction book called An Elegant Defense. Um, and then there are plenty of great sort of introductory Coursera courses on immunology. And then you can pick up Janeway's Immunology, which is kind of the canonical textbook, and then maybe like the clinical notes to Janeway's Immunology is how they manifest in clinical, apparatus. Nature Reviews Immunology, where people review all the different parts of the immune system. And then honestly, just talking to immunologists and then being like, tell me all your secrets. Like,
Yeah.
and you don't even
Right.
need to talk to professors. I think they're unbelievably smart people, but like, for the low price of like dinner, you can probably take out any grad student who can give you all of the basics and secrets about like their field, um, and who are just going to be so happy that you took them out to eat. So
Right.
it's and so I think that's kind of how we, you know, go in there. It's like start at like low resolution, but cover the entire field, and then go into higher and higher resolution, information streams.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Francisco. This was really interesting, and I hope we can continue the conversation offline too.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so
Thanks.
much for having me, Kunal.
Thanks a lot.